The sun was setting over the kingdom of Valdarin, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets of the capital. The castle, high on its hill, looked almost alive in the fading light. Its towers pierced the sky, black against the crimson clouds, and from afar the citizens whispered tales of the Alpha King who ruled with unmatched power. Some said he could command storms. Others said he could see through a man's heart as if it were glass. Most feared him. A few admired him. In the bustling square beneath the castle, villagers prepared for the evening festival. Lanterns swayed in the wind, filling the streets with soft golden light. Stalls offered sweets, roasted meats, and handcrafted trinkets. Children ran between adults laughing, their voices echoing off the stone walls. Music played from a nearby stage, a soft, haunting melody that seemed to capture the melancholy beauty of the kingdom. Among the crowd moved a small girl. She was no older than 10, with hair the color of autumn wheat and eyes so bright they seemed to hold a secret no one could understand. Her shoes were worn and her dress, though clean, had clearly been patched many times. Yet she moved with purpose, weaving through the crowd as if guided by some invisible force. The girl's name was Lyria. For weeks, she had been listening to the stories of the Alpha King, his strength, his wisdom, and his cold, unyielding rule. Most children her age would have trembled at the thought of approaching him. But Lyria was different. She had a fire inside her that could not be dimmed, and she had a question that needed answering. As she reached the base of the castle steps, the music faded, replaced by the low murmur of guards and courtiers. The king had come to observe the festival from his balcony, as was tradition. His presence commanded silence. People stopped in their tracks, bowing their heads as he appeared, tall and imposing, clad in dark armor that shimmered in the dying light. His hair was black as midnight, and his eyes were sharp and piercing. Many whispered that those eyes could cut through a man's soul and leave nothing behind. Lyria's small chest heaved as she approached the steps, but she did not falter. She climbed carefully, ignoring the whispers of the adults around her. "What is she thinking?" murmured one noblewoman. "Does she not fear him?" Another shook her head. Some children have no sense of danger at all. Finally, Lyria reached the top of the steps. The king looked down at her, his expression unreadable. There was no anger, no amusement, only curiosity. The girl met his gaze without bowing, without hesitation. I have something to tell you," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling of her small hands. The king raised an eyebrow. "Go on," he said, his voice deep, calm, and commanding. "I will be your queen someday," Lyria said, the words falling from her lips like a declaration of fate rather than a childish boast. A murmur ran through the crowd. Courtiers gasped. Guards stiffened. Even the musicians faltered, as if the notes in their instruments had suddenly lost their tune. The king studied the girl. For a long moment he said nothing. Then finally he spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "You are bold. For a child." "I mean it," Lyria said, stepping closer. "I've watched you and I know you are. Not like other kings. You are strong, yes, but also lonely. One day I will stand beside you." The king's eyes softened for the briefest instant. He looked past the girl, out over the crowd, and for a moment he saw not the castle walls, not the festival, not the whispered rumors, but a life that had been denied to him. A life of warmth, of companionship, of trust. "You speak with confidence, little one," he said finally. "Do you even understand what it means to be a queen?" "I do," she said, her gaze unwavering. "A queen is not only powerful, she protects her people. She stands with the king in all things, and she never turns away no matter what comes." The king felt something stir within him, an unfamiliar mix of admiration, caution, and curiosity. No child had ever dared speak to him this way. None had ever made him feel the strange weight of possibility that her words carried. "Very well," he said after a long pause. "I will remember what you have said." Lyria smiled, a small, triumphant smile that held the promise of storms and fire. She bowed her head slightly and began to step back down the stairs. But then she paused, glancing over her shoulder. "I will return," she called. "And you will see. I am not just a child's dream." The king watched her disappear into the crowd. The words lingered in his mind like a whisper carried on the wind, haunting and persistent. For the first time in decades, he felt something he could not name, a sense that destiny had begun weaving a new thread through the tapestry of his life. As the festival continued, the king remained on his balcony, silent. The laughter and music filled the night, but in his mind the girl's promise echoed endlessly. Guards and nobles came and went, offering reports and advice, but he barely heard them. His gaze kept returning to the path she had taken, imagining the child growing, imagining the truth behind her fierce eyes. Meanwhile, Lyria's heart raced. She had spoken her truth, dared to claim her future, and felt the first spark of something larger than herself ignite. She had taken a step that most would never dare, but she did not yet understand how far that step would carry her, or how dangerous the path might be. As darkness fell, the festival lights glimmered like stars fallen to earth. In the shadowed alleys, mysterious figures whispered to one another, their voices low and cautious. The kingdom of Valdarin was a place of intrigue, of whispered deals and hidden threats. And though Lyria had made her bold declaration, not all eyes that watched her were friendly. From the high towers of the castle, the Alpha King stood alone, staring into the night. He did not move, did not speak. The wind caught the hem of his cloak, and the lanterns below swayed with an almost musical rhythm. His mind returned to the girl's words, "I'll be your queen someday." A shadow flickered across the balcony behind him, a servant with a report perhaps, or a guard alerting him to some danger. But he barely noticed. He was thinking of the child, imagining the woman she might become, imagining a future that had been denied him for so long. Deep in the castle's dark corridors, an old sage whispered to himself, reading from a dusty scroll. "The prophecy stirs once more," he muttered. "The child who dares to speak. She carries the fate of kings." Lyria, meanwhile, made her way home through the crowded streets. She was tired but exhilarated. She had thrown herself into the current of destiny and felt it carry her forward. In her chest, her heart thumped with a mixture of fear and triumph. She did not yet know the trials that awaited her, the dangers that would test her courage, or the choices that would weigh heavily upon her. But for the first time she felt she had touched the edge of something greater than herself, and high above in the castle's darkened tower, the Alpha King made a silent vow. Whatever the future held, he would remember the child with the fiery eyes, the girl who dared to speak of queenship and destiny. He did not yet know how or when, but he knew that somehow their paths would cross again. The night deepened. Lanterns flickered. Shadows danced along the walls, and in the heart of the kingdom, a promise hung in the air, waiting for the years to pass, waiting for the chains of time to bring two lives together once more. For in the kingdom of Valdarin, fate did not forget, and destiny, once spoken aloud, could never be silenced. The gates of the castle of Valdarin creaked open under the weight of the approaching caravan. Soldiers lined the walls, their armor glinting in the pale morning light. The city had not seen such a procession in decades. Cloaked figures riding sturdy horses, banners torn and faded, and a single prisoner in chains. Leading them all, the Alpha King, tall and commanding on the balcony, observed silently. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, narrowed as he studied the figure in the center. Something about the prisoner's posture, the strength in her shoulders despite the chains, stirred a memory he thought long buried. "Bring her forward," the king commanded in a voice that left no room for argument. His courtiers and guards obeyed, and the caravan halted in the courtyard. Dust swirled around their feet, mixing with the faint smell of straw and sweat. The prisoner was led down, chains clinking with every step, her head held high, a calm defiance in her eyes. When the Alpha King finally saw her face, his breath caught. The child who had once promised to be his queen had grown into a woman of striking presence. Her hair, darkened with age, framed a face that was both beautiful and hardened by experience. Her eyes, the same vivid color as when she was 10, now held shadows of a life forged in struggle. She stopped a few feet from the throne, her chains pulled taut by the guards. The crowd murmured, sensing the tension between the prisoner and the king. She did not lower her gaze. She did not bow. Instead, she looked directly at him, and for the first time in many years, the Alpha King felt a stir he had not felt in decades, a mixture of recognition, surprise, and unease. "Lyria," he said, his voice steady but carrying a note of disbelief. You have returned." "I have," she replied, her voice calm and unwavering. "And I have not come alone." She glanced at the surrounding soldiers who shifted uneasily under her gaze. "I bring news that cannot wait, and a warning that must be heard. The king gestured for the guards to release her chains, but his trusted captain shook his head. "Your Majesty, she is still a prisoner of the Eastern Kingdom. We cannot risk her escaping." The king's jaw tightened. "I do not need a reminder of her captivity," he said, though his eyes never left Lyria. "I need to hear what she has to say." Lyria's gaze softened slightly, just enough to remind the king of the child she once was. 20 years have passed, she said. "I am no longer the girl who dared to speak to you in the festival. I am here with knowledge that can save your kingdom or see it fall." Whispers ran through the crowd. The courtiers looked uneasy, sensing that the prisoner was more than she seemed. Even the king's advisors, experienced and cautious, felt a shiver of curiosity, and perhaps fear. "What knowledge?" The king demanded, his tone sharp. "Speak clearly, Lyria. Do not waste time with riddles." She nodded, stepping closer despite the remaining chains. "There are forces at work in the shadows, Your Majesty. Ancient curses long thought dormant are stirring again. There are those who would see you fall, not through armies or steel, but through magic and betrayal. I have seen it, I have survived it, and I know how it can be stopped." The king frowned, a mixture of skepticism and interest crossing his face. "You speak boldly for a prisoner, and you ask me to trust you?" "I ask you to remember," Lyria said softly, "that I once spoke of a promise. That promise was not a child's dream. It was truth. I have waited, grown, and learned. I am here now because fate has brought us together again." For a moment, the courtyard was silent. The citizens, soldiers, and courtiers all watched the exchange, feeling the weight of history and destiny pressing down upon them. The Alpha King's mind raced. Memories of a small, determined girl came flooding back, mixing with the striking presence of the woman before him. He had expected a prisoner, frightened and meek. Instead, he saw someone who could stand beside him, perhaps even challenge him. "You speak as though you have always known this moment would come," he said, his voice low. "Tell me, Lyria, did you truly believe the King of Valdarin would remember a child's promise after 20 years? "I did," she said without hesitation, "and I have never forgotten it. Even in chains, even in exile, my thoughts returned to this place, to you, and to what I vowed. I did not return for revenge. I did not return as a spy. I returned to fulfill a promise, and to protect what must be protected." The king studied her face, noting the subtle lines of hardship and the strength that radiated from her. He realized that the girl who had once approached him fearlessly had become a woman capable of surviving trials he could only imagine. Yet beneath her strength he sensed a vulnerability, a quiet longing that mirrored his own hidden solitude. "Very well," he said finally, his voice steady but carrying the weight of unspoken questions. "You will speak freely, but under my watch. No harm will come to you here, yet you will not leave my sight." Lyria inclined her head, accepting the conditions, though she did not show relief. "I understand, Your Majesty," she said, "but you must trust that I know what I am doing. The forces at work are not patient. Delay may cost us more than time." The king nodded, signaling the guards to lower her chains completely. As the metal fell away, a soft sound echoed in the courtyard, a quiet, almost musical chime that seemed to mark a shift in the air. The citizens felt it too, a subtle tension that hinted at events far greater than themselves. That evening, in the private chambers of the castle, the king and Lyria spoke at length. Candles flickered along the walls, casting long shadows that danced like silent witnesses. Lyria recounted her journey, the Eastern Kingdom that had captured her, the harsh winters and relentless training she endured, the whispers of dark magic that haunted the lands beyond the borders. The king listened, his expression unreadable, yet his eyes betrayed a growing admiration. Every word she spoke reminded him of the girl he had once met, the girl who had dared to declare a promise. But now she spoke with the voice of a woman shaped by hardship, tempered by survival and strengthened by determination. "You have changed," he said finally, his voice soft, almost reverent. "You are not the child who spoke to me in the festival. You are more." Lyria allowed herself a faint smile. "I had to become more. The world is not kind to those who remain children. But some things never change, even with time. I have always remembered my promise, and I have always known it would bring me back to you." The king's heart stirred in a way he had not felt in years. He had ruled with strength and fear, yet in this moment, he felt something entirely new. A pull toward someone who had defied every expectation, someone who had survived darkness and returned with courage unmatched. A sudden noise outside the chamber drew both their attention. A servant appeared, breathless. "Your Majesty." Guards report unusual movements near the outer walls. Shadows. People who should not be there. The king's eyes darkened. "Prepare the soldiers," he said, his voice commanding. "If these threats are connected to what Lyria has warned me of, we will meet them together. Stay close and trust no one beyond these walls." Lyria's gaze met his, and in that silent exchange, a connection formed, one built on shared purpose, history, and the unspoken tension of promises made long ago. Neither spoke of the years that had passed, nor of the dangers that lay ahead, but both understood that their fates were entwined, and that whatever came next would test them in ways neither could predict. The castle grew quiet as night fell. Lanterns glimmered along the walls, and the wind whispered through the trees beyond the gates. The Alpha King and the woman who had once been a child stood together in the dim candlelight, each aware that the events of this night would mark the beginning of a story far larger than either had imagined. And somewhere in the shadows beyond the castle, unseen eyes watched. Figures cloaked in black moved silently, carrying secrets and schemes that would challenge the king and the woman at every turn. The kingdom was a place of power, of magic, of destiny, and the two at its center were about to discover that the past, the present, and the future were bound together in ways that could neither escape nor ignore. The night air hung heavy over the castle of Valdarin, thick with mist that crept along the stone walls like a living thing. Lanterns flickered, casting long shadows that stretched into the courtyard, twisting and bending with the wind. The Alpha King stood by the balcony, his eyes scanning the outer walls, his hands clenched into fists. Beside him, Lyria watched silently, her presence calm but alert. "The shadows move again," she murmured, her voice low and measured. "This is not the work of men alone." The king's jaw tightened. "Explain." Lyria turned to face him, her eyes reflecting both the candlelight and the moon above. "The curse that haunts Valdarin. It is awakening. The Eastern Kingdom did not merely imprison me. They tried to use me to draw it forth. They failed, but the remnants of their dark magic remain, and now it stirs in secret, waiting for the right moment to strike." The king's mind raced. He had heard whispers of curses tied to his lineage, of long-forgotten oaths and ancient pacts, but he had never believed them fully. Yet standing here with Lyria beside him, he felt the weight of truth pressing down. Her words carried authority and certainty. "You speak as though you have seen it," he said, his voice quieter now, edged with unease. "Have you?" "I have," she admitted. "And I survived. That is why I am here, to help you prepare. The forces at work are patient, silent, and relentless. They wait for cracks in our strength, for hesitation, for fear. We cannot afford either." The king nodded slowly. There was no time for disbelief, no room for hesitation. He had faced armies, traitors, and assassins, but this was different. This was invisible, pervasive, and ancient. And for the first time, he felt the need for someone beside him who understood it. Not a guard, not an advisor, but someone who had endured the darkness firsthand. "You have changed," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Not just in strength, but in the way you see the world. You are ready." Lyria's lips curved in a faint smile. "I had to be. To survive is to learn, and to learn is to prepare. But survival alone is not enough. We must act before the shadows find their moment." The castle gates rattled once more, a subtle sound almost lost in the night. Both turned instinctively, hands moving toward unseen weapons. But there was nothing there, only the wind stirring the mist. Lyria's eyes narrowed. "It watches," she whispered. "It tests." The Alpha King felt a chill run down his spine. Even after years of commanding armies and ruling a kingdom, he could not shake the sense of unseen eyes tracing their every move. He had learned to trust instinct over sight, and tonight his instinct screamed in warning. "Tell me everything," he said, leading her into a private chamber. The walls were lined with tapestries depicting battles and kings long gone. A fire crackled in the hearth, sending flickering light across the room. Here, away from the crowd, away from the prying eyes of the court, they could speak freely. Lyria began to recount her journey after her capture. She told of the Eastern Kingdom's dark scholars, who had tried to harness the lingering magic of the ancient curse to control the Alpha King's bloodline. They had failed, but their experiments left marks, symbols carved into the land, whispers of power lingering in the wind, and creatures born of shadow that waited in the forests. She had witnessed them, evaded them, and learned to understand their patterns. The king listened, absorbing every word. His mind, trained in strategy and war, began to trace the paths of danger she described. Each detail painted a picture of a threat that was not only real but immediate. "You speak as though we can fight it," he said. "But how? How do you fight something that is everywhere yet nowhere?" "You do not fight it alone," Lyria said. "You need knowledge, preparation, and allies you can trust, and someone who has felt it in their bones." Her eyes met his, steady and unwavering. "That is why I am here. I am not asking for mercy or favor. I am offering strength if you choose to accept it." The king considered her words. There was something in her presence that commanded respect. Something that reminded him of the promise she had made as a child. Back then it had been a curious, bold declaration. Now it carried weight, power, and inevitability. "Very well," he said finally. "We will act together. But you must understand, trust is earned, not given lightly. The kingdom depends on it." "I understand," she said, "and I am ready to earn it. Every step, every decision. I will prove my loyalty and my strength." The chamber was silent for a long moment, the only sound the fire crackling in the hearth. Then, a distant howl echoed through the night, carried on the wind. It was not human, nor entirely animal, a sound that sent a shiver through both of them. "That is only the beginning," Lyria said softly. "The curse stirs, and those who serve it are already in motion. We do not have the luxury of waiting." The king felt a surge of resolve. For decades he had ruled Valdaran with iron and fire, facing every challenge with strength alone. But now, with Lyria by his side, he felt a new kind of power, one born of alliance, of shared purpose, and of trust forged in the shadow of danger. "We begin at dawn," he said. "We will gather our allies, fortify the castle, and seek the sources of this curse. And we will face whatever comes together." Lyria nodded. There was a quiet satisfaction in her expression, a sense of anticipation mixed with caution. She had survived years of captivity, witnessed the darkness of the world, and endured the shadow of death itself. Yet standing here with the Alpha King beside her, she felt a spark of hope, a feeling she had not allowed herself for many years. The night deepened, the mist swirling thicker around the castle. From the towers, the guards kept watch, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of intrusion. But the true threat was not visible, not yet. It moved in patterns unseen, guided by ancient forces that had waited decades for the right moment. Suddenly, a soft sound came from the courtyard below. The Alpha King tensed, hand moving toward the hilt of his sword. Lyria's gaze sharpened. The shadows twisted, taking shape. Two figures emerged, cloaked in black, their movements silent, almost supernatural. "You have arrived early," Lyria whispered, her voice barely audible. "They have come to test us." The king's eyes narrowed. He did not recognize them, yet there was a familiarity in their movement, a precision that hinted at training beyond ordinary men. They were here not to parley, not to negotiate. They were here to provoke, to gauge the strength of the king and the woman who had returned. "Prepare yourself," Lyria said, drawing a dagger from her belt. "They will not leave without a challenge, and we must be ready for everything." The Alpha King moved beside her, his own sword drawn. For decades he had faced countless enemies, but tonight was different. The danger was invisible, the stakes unknown, and the woman beside him was both ally and enigma. The past, the present, and the promise made long ago converged in the cold night air. The figures advanced silently, their eyes gleaming from beneath their hoods. The Alpha King and Lyria met their gaze unflinching. Every instinct, every lesson, every memory of strategy and survival was alive in them. The first figure stepped forward, the ground beneath his feet silent, his intent clear. And as the clash began, the castle walls seemed to hold their breath, as if aware that the events unfolding now would change the fate of Valdaran forever. The morning sun rose pale and weak over Valdaran, filtering through mist that still clung stubbornly to the castle towers. The Alpha King and Lyria stood in the courtyard, surveying the aftermath of the previous night's confrontation. The figures that had attacked were gone, leaving only the echoes of their presence in the trampled grass and disturbed stones. Yet the sense of unease remained, heavy and unrelenting. "They were only scouts," Lyria said quietly, her voice calm but serious. "Someone is testing the castle, probing our defenses. This was meant to see how prepared we are. But it is not the true enemy." The king's hand tightened around the hilt of his sword. "Then where is the real threat?" he asked, his voice low, dangerous with contained fury. If they have come this close, then it is only a matter of time before the storm reaches us fully. Lyria's eyes darkened, her expression thoughtful. The curse that haunts this kingdom is older than the walls of Valdarin. It is not bound by armies or borders. It works in whispers and shadows, and it has allies who walk among us unseen. The king's jaw tightened. He had faced spies, traitors, and assassins before. But the idea that a malevolent force might already be within his castle made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Then we must uncover them, he said firmly, before they strike. Together they moved through the castle, checking doors, secret passages, and guard rotations. Lyria pointed out subtle signs of tampering, marks on walls, faint disturbances in dust, almost imperceptible shifts that hinted someone had been there recently. Her knowledge was precise, born from years of surviving in captivity and evading those who sought to control her. "You see what others overlook," the king remarked, his voice soft. "I had forgotten that details can be as deadly as swords." Lyria smiled faintly, but there was no pride in it. "Survival teaches attention. You cannot afford distraction when the shadows move around you." Hours passed, and the tension within the castle grew. Servants moved nervously, soldiers whispered among themselves, and even the courtiers seemed aware that the air was charged with anticipation. The Alpha King and Lyria retreated to the strategy room, a circular chamber lined with maps, old manuscripts, and instruments of war. "We need to know who we can trust," Lyria said, moving her finger along a map of the kingdom. "There are people in the Eastern Kingdom who serve the darkness willingly, but there are also those who are unwitting, merely following orders without understanding the magic they aid." The king leaned over the table, studying the routes and regions marked by her. "Then we need to act quickly. Secure the borders, strengthen the castle, and find allies who will stand with us no matter the cost." Lyria's gaze met his, sharp and unwavering. "And we must confront the source directly. The curse has a heart, a center, and until we face it, it will continue to spread its influence. Every day we delay, the risk grows." The king nodded. He had faced countless enemies, yet something in her words and presence inspired both caution and courage. She had returned not as a child with a promise, but as a woman of knowledge, strength, and unyielding resolve. The bond forming between them was subtle yet undeniable, an alliance forged by necessity and tempered by mutual respect. As evening fell, a message arrived from the southern watchtower. A courier riding hard and fast delivered a sealed scroll. The seal bore a mark the king recognized instantly, the emblem of a noble, long-thought loyal, now tainted with suspicion. The king broke the seal, reading the message aloud. "The eastern forests are not safe. Shadows move within them, and several villages report sightings of figures cloaked in black. They speak of a prophecy, one that names the return of the child who will stand beside the Alpha King." Lyria's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed. "They know about me," she said quietly. "This is why they came last night. It was a warning and a test. They want to see if I am ready, if you are ready, and if either of us fails, then Valdarin falls," the king finished grimly. Night fell quickly over the castle, darker than usual, as though the heavens themselves were aware of the approaching storm. Lyria and the king prepared for what was to come. Guards were doubled, patrols increased, and the castle gates reinforced. Yet even with these measures, a sense of foreboding lingered. Midnight approached. The castle was quiet, almost unnaturally so. Then a soft tapping echoed through the corridors, almost imperceptible against the stone walls. Lyria froze. "They are here," she whispered, moving silently toward the sound. The king followed, every muscle tense, his senses alert to the slightest movement. In the shadow of the hallway, two figures emerged, cloaked, silent, and swift. The king and Lyria advanced cautiously, knowing this encounter was more than a mere skirmish. The figures did not attack immediately, but circled, testing, probing. Then in a sudden flash, one lunged. Lyria moved with precision, parrying the attack effortlessly. The king's sword met the second assailant, sparks flying as steel clashed. The duel was swift and intense, the two sides testing each other's strength, skill, and resolve. But unlike ordinary attackers, these figures moved with a strange grace, as if guided by forces beyond human comprehension. The fight ended almost as quickly as it began. The cloaked figures vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only the sound of their retreating footsteps. The Alpha King and Lyria stood in silence, catching their breath, aware that this was only the beginning. "They will return," Lyria said, her voice calm but firm, "and next time they will not come alone." The king looked at her, noting the determination in her eyes, the confidence in her stance. "Then we must be ready," he said, "and we must be stronger than we have ever been." Over the next days, the king and Lyria worked tirelessly. They trained soldiers, studied old texts for knowledge of the curse, and explored the hidden passages beneath the castle, seeking clues. In the quiet moments, they spoke of the past, the promise made by a child the years apart, and the strange paths that had led them to this point. "You were always brave," the king said one evening, watching her train with a sword. "I remember the girl who dared to speak of queenship, and now I see the woman who can face shadows without fear." Lyria paused, resting her sword on her shoulder. "Bravery alone is not enough. You need wisdom, knowledge, and allies. That is why I returned, not for myself, but for what must be done." Their conversations grew deeper, and so did the unspoken connection between them. Neither spoke openly of the feelings stirring, but in shared glances and subtle gestures, both recognized a bond that went beyond words, a connection forged by time, trial, and destiny. Then one night, a whisper came from the depths of the castle, a voice that seemed to slither through the walls. "You cannot stop what has begun." The Alpha King and Lyria froze, their eyes meeting. Neither spoke immediately, but the chill that ran through the castle told them the truth. The curse was no longer distant. It had already begun to take root within the kingdom, and its influence was growing. "We are not alone," Lyria said quietly, "and this time the challenge will test us in ways we cannot yet imagine." The king's gaze hardened. "Then we face it together. Whatever comes, we will stand. And whoever stands against Valdarin will find that its Alpha King does not face darkness alone." Lyria nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. Years of training, suffering, and survival had led her here. She was no longer a child who made a bold promise. She was a warrior, an ally, and someone who understood the gravity of the threats that moved unseen. And beside her, the king was not only a ruler but a man capable of trust, courage, and action beyond the confines of fear. The night stretched long and quiet, the castle holding its breath. Somewhere in the shadows beyond the walls, forces moved, plotting, waiting, and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. And within the walls of Valdarin, two figures, one king, one warrior, stood ready to meet destiny head-on. Dawn broke over Valdarin, pale and fragile, the light barely touching the tops of the castle towers. But the kingdom was no longer quiet. Smoke curled from the streets, the distant echoes of chaos carried on the wind. The northern wall of the castle had been breached, and the city below was alive with the clash of unseen forces. The Alpha King and Lyria stood together on the balcony, surveying the destruction. Soldiers moved quickly, attempting to contain the threat, but even their courage could only slow what was coming. The darkness was alive, moving in ways neither man nor beast could predict. "This is it," Lyria said, her voice steady, though her eyes betrayed the weight of the moment. "The heart of the curse has arrived. Whatever we face now will decide the fate of the kingdom." The king nodded, his expression dark yet resolute. "Then we face it together. Nothing has ever defeated Valdarin while I still stand, and I will not let it fall now. Not with you by my side." Lyria's gaze softened just for a moment as she met his eyes. They shared a silent understanding. This was more than strategy or power. This was destiny, fate, and the promise that had bound them together for 2 decades. Without a word, they moved to the castle's inner halls, where ancient texts and relics of power were kept. Lyria examined the symbols carved into the walls, her fingers tracing the lines that glowed faintly in the dim light. "This is where it begins," she said. "The curse draws strength from history, from forgotten oaths, from fear itself. To stop it, we must confront it at its source." The king's eyes narrowed. "Then we go there, now." They descended into the castle's hidden passages, the air growing colder with every step. Shadows stretched along the walls, moving in ways that seemed almost sentient. Lyria lit a small lantern, its flame steady despite the chill. "It knows we are coming," she whispered, "and it will try to stop us at every turn." The corridors twisted and turned, leading them beneath the foundations of Valdarin. Ancient carvings lined the walls, symbols of old kings, warnings, and protective spells. Lyria studied them carefully, murmuring incantations under her breath. The king followed closely, alert to every sound, every flicker of movement in the dark. At last they reached a vast chamber deep beneath the castle. The air was thick with an unnatural fog, and the faint sound of chanting echoed through the darkness. At the center of the chamber stood a figure cloaked in black, eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. Around it, shadows writhed like living creatures, curling toward the ceiling, twisting along the floor. "This is it," Lyria said, her voice low and unwavering. "The heart of the darkness." The figure spoke, its voice a hiss that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You cannot stop what has been set in motion. Valdarin belongs to the shadows now." The king stepped forward, his sword raised. "Not while I still breathe. Not while the kingdom stands. You will not succeed." The shadow figure laughed, a sound that made the walls tremble. "Foolish mortal. You cannot fight what is eternal. You cannot fight the past, the bloodline, the curse that flows through these lands." Lyria's eyes blazed. "You underestimate the strength of those who fight together. Power alone does not decide fate. Courage, will, and unity do." The figure raised its hand, and the shadows surged forward, twisting and striking with impossible speed. The king met them head-on, swinging his sword with precision, cutting through the darkness, each strike ringing against the stone walls. Lyria moved with equal grace, her daggers flashing, her incantations glowing as she disrupted the shadow's influence. The battle was fierce and unrelenting. Every strike, every movement was met with resistance, as though the darkness had a mind of its own. Yet the king and Lyria moved as one, their synergy born of trust, experience, and the bond that had been forged over 20 years. "You were always meant to stand beside me," the king said, shouting over the clash of shadow and steel. "Do not falter now." "I will not," Lyria replied, her voice strong and determined. She leapt forward, striking a symbol carved into the floor, a mark of power that glowed brightly under her touch. Energy surged from the symbol, radiating outward, pushing back the shadows and weakening the figure at the center. The cloaked figure hissed, recoiling. "Impossible. How can mere mortals wield such power? The power comes from more than steel or magic," the king said, stepping closer to Lyria. "It comes from promise, courage, and the bonds we honor. You cannot destroy what is stronger than fear." Together they focused their strength. Lyria chanted the final incantation, her voice rising over the wind and shadows, while the king struck a decisive blow at the heart of the figure. Light exploded in the chamber, blinding and pure, and the shadows screamed as they were torn apart, unraveling like threads of smoke. When the light faded, the chamber was quiet. The cloaked figure was gone, leaving only the remnants of the curse, now scattered and powerless. The king and Lyria stood together, breathing heavily, their swords lowered, their eyes meeting in a moment of unspoken triumph. "It is done," Lyria said softly, exhaustion and relief mingling in her voice. "The curse, it is broken." The king nodded, his hand brushing hers briefly, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had endured together. "You were right," he said quietly. "Strength is nothing without courage, and courage is nothing without unity. Today we have proven it." The chamber began to brighten as the first rays of sunlight filtered through cracks above. The kingdom above, once shadowed by fear, would see a new dawn. A dawn born of endurance, bravery, and the fulfillment of promises made long ago. Lyria looked at the king, a faint smile touching her lips. "Do you remember the promise I made?" she asked softly, her eyes reflecting the golden light. The king's gaze softened. "I do," he said. "And now? It feels as though the promise has found its time." For a long moment they stood together in silence, the weight of the past and the relief of victory surrounding them. The battle was over, but more than that, the years of waiting, longing, and destiny had finally converged. "Then let this be a new beginning," the king said, his voice steady. "For the kingdom, for the people, and for us." Lyria nodded, feeling the truth of his words. She had returned in chains as a prisoner, 20 years after a bold promise made by a child. Now she stood free, not just of captivity, but of the fear and shadows that had haunted her and the kingdom. Outside, Valdarin began to stir. Citizens cautiously emerged from their homes, peering at the morning light and the calm that had returned. The soldiers, weary but resolute, took their positions along the walls, ready to defend the kingdom if necessary, yet sensing that the darkness that had threatened them was gone. For now. The Alpha King and Lyria ascended to the castle balcony, The city sprawled beneath them like a map of history and memory. He placed a hand on her shoulder, firm and reassuring. "You have fulfilled your promise," he said, "and in doing so you have changed not only the kingdom but me." Lyria looked out over the city, feeling the warmth of the sun and the weight of destiny lifted from her shoulders. "And you have changed too," she said softly. "You have learned that even kings cannot face everything alone, that even strength is made stronger by trust, loyalty, and shared purpose." The wind carried their words across the castle walls, whispering through the streets and alleys, through the forests and hills beyond. The kingdom of Valdarin had endured darkness, confronted fear, and now stood ready to face the future, stronger, wiser, and united. The Alpha King turned to Lyria, his eyes meeting hers. For the first time in decades, he felt not the solitude of power, but the warmth of connection, the certainty of partnership, and the quiet joy of a promise fulfilled. "Then let us begin," he said, his voice full of hope and determination. "Let us rebuild, protect, and rule together." Lyria nodded, stepping close. "Together," she said, her voice carrying both strength and the memory of the child she had once been. As the sun climbed higher, the castle and city of Valdarin glowed with light and promise. The shadows of the past had been defeated, the curse undone, and the future, though uncertain, was now theirs to shape. In that moment, the king and Lyria stood not just as ruler and ally, not just as survivor and warrior, but as two people bound by destiny, courage, and a promise made long ago. The journey had been long, the trials great, but the darkness had been overcome. And in the light of the new day, Valdarin had hope once more.